Meanwhile, we warned you they were coming for the guns, and we've warned you they will use the economic crisis or any other pretext they can to enact martial law. With that in mind, Paul Joseph Watson has rounded up some of our past reportage, now put into context as we see them moving really quickly down that slippery slope of tyranny. Obama would call on the military to disarm Americans during a national emergency. How? The blueprint is outlined in a series of Army manuals that details the confiscation of firearms and how they will declare a civil emergency and contain that crisis. One of those is called the Civil Disturbance Operations Manual, released originally in 2006, then updated in 2010 under the title FM 3-39.40 Internment and Resettlement Operations. We've covered that in detail at length over the past year or so, but just a few of those highlights in retrospect. Warning shots will not be fired, according to page 20, and overall they describe how in containing a civil unrest situations, they will send military and or police forces to physically guard stores where they sell or distribute liquor, arms and ammunition, drugs, and everything else under the sun to prevent them from getting into the hands of rioters. Furthermore, we already know from the Katrina disaster that they will do gun confiscation even at gunpoint, door to door. It's been done before, and it's what they plan to do during civil emergencies. Rob Dew did that excellent viral video breakdown of that earlier in the year that has now over 1.2 million views. We played it last night. You can find it up on the YouTube channel for The Alex Jones Channel. Meanwhile, a North Carolina police lieutenant warns of plans for martial law coming in 2013. He called in to Pastor Butch Paul's show on GCN Live the other day and described how they are doing training for active martial law scenarios to take place during this year. This clip really speaks for itself. Let's go to that right now.
You're a lieutenant in the police or the military?
The police department.
What's your opinion?
Things are going downhill very quickly, sir.
What are you hearing from your superiors of what's coming down and what you're looking for?
Well, they're looking for it to happen, and they're training for it to happen.
Now you said they're training to take us down or training to defend us?
Yes, sir. Training to take us down. And
really?
Law enforcement here in North Carolina has started training with drones, military-operated drones.
Wow. Okay, they started training with military drones in North Carolina.
Yes, sir. That's correct, sir.
And your superiors are training the forces to take down the American people.
Yes, sir.
Things are very alarming. For those of you who've not caught up to speed yet, are still trying to figure out the scenario, there's an excellent retelling of the really true, but what many would consider alternate history of our modern day. It's written by financial expert James Quinn under the title Obedience to Authority, Should We Trust the Government? It's a long 13-page article. Obviously, we're not going to get into the whole thing now, but he starts off with kind of the anecdotal reference to that famous Pink Floyd song, Mother, one of the lyrics of which is, "Mother, should I trust the government?" and goes on to describe a range of kind of subtle tyrannies and how he was at a concert for Roger Waters, the head of Pink Floyd, and when he sang, "Mother, should I trust the government?" the whole crowd of 40,000 people shouted no. In other words, people are starting to wake up, but why is the system itself still perpetuating and accelerating its tyranny? Well, we just have to look at all the tactics they've used, the psychological techniques between Aldous Huxley, between Edward Bernays, between George Orwell, and plenty of others, and we see our answer. He writes, "They have created a totalitarian state built upon egotism, material goods, and fulfilling our desires through Wall Street, peddled debt, and mass consumerism. It's been an incredibly effective form of control that has convinced the masses to love their servitude." Now, that's a reference, of course, to the Brave New World quote written by Aldous Huxley, who predicted that in a future tyranny, really the final revolution, the system system would get the population to actually love its own enslavement because they'd be so doped up and so controlled and regimented that they wouldn't know any different. And he goes on to describe how it's this whole consumer society, the creation of Great Society, handouts and dependency things starting in the 60s, going back, of course, to the FDR days in the 30s, the rise of the credit card for the first time in the 70s, giving consumers access to cheap debt. All this stuff is coming to a head, all these banker schemes. It's mathematically becoming impossible to continue. So how will they continue it? Well, the system has a credibility crisis, but basically the population has learned to love its authority. It is obedient to authority. This was proved in the Milgram experiments back in the 70s and in many other respects, where they found that even when people don't like what's being done, they respect that authority and obey it because they're afraid to do otherwise, essentially. That was the experiment where they brought in test subjects to shock people when they got the wrong answers and found that more than 65% of those in the test were willing to administer deadly electrical shocks just for people getting the wrong answers on word association exams. It really says a lot about our society. But this article goes on and explains, really sums up this big problem in a great paragraph here. Why do we have 47 million plus on food stamps? Why are the bankers allowed to loot and continue their big crimes? Well, we're in a system where there's too little cash, too few jobs, too much debt, too many takers, too few makers, too many bankers, too much delusion, and too few resources to sustain the unsustainable. We have entered the end stages of a ravenous locust swarm. The fields have been stripped barren, and what's more, a lot of people know it. If you stop obeying that system, if you say no to it, and if you let them know you see through their illusion, well, that's really the only chance we have to put this thing to bed. Otherwise, a system that seeks power will keep its power. It was explained thoroughly in 1984. Power is not a means to an end. It's not something they do to enact some kind of paradise or utopia. A system that craves power wants only that. They want power for the sake of power. And so you really can't trust that system. More on that note of how we've been all caught up in the debt and how we as human beings are seen as collateral for the system is in this clip I found in the National Archives. It's in a family planning clip program, which is really just a euphemism for eugenics. I wrote the article yesterday. Under eugenics, you are a human resource slave to the New World Order. They really call us human resources, talk about how they need to control the breeding and the production of human beings because we fit into the larger planned economy where we have no economic freedom, where they could ship our jobs to China, you name it, and we're not to be in charge of even how many babies we have. Let's go to that clip now. Aaron Dykes here on January 1st, 2013. Now, Alex Jones talked on the show today about how the system views us as human resources. And this is happening more and more under the eugenics model, more and more here in the United States as we adopt Obamacare, as we move towards a planned economy where there's limited economic options and less freedom all the time. Now, I just want to point out they really do consider us human resources. I'm going to play you a clip from a 1974 family planning clip called Communicate, Speak, They Are Listening. Family planning is, of course, code for eugenics. It's the softer side of Sears, the softer side of eugenics. Let's go to that clip right now.
In Kenya, the Minister of Finance and Development offers valuable support.
Well, my views, which really are government views, is that family planning is an integral part of development planning. It is an essential part for the reason that you cannot hope to plan other forms of production if you cannot plan the production of the main resource, the human beings. We view it as an aspect of human freedom.
Incredibly, you see this finance and development minister claim that it's the state's role to decide how many people reproduce, who and when, because they are human resources, part of the overall planned economy system, which time and again leads to limited freedom and basically totally slavery. But on top of that, you see this incredible 1984 Orwellian backwards doublespeak where freedom is slavery. Somehow when the state tells you if you can breed or not, that's freedom from the natural restrictions on breeding that otherwise occur.
So that is not slave to just natural forces. And this is what I said in Swahili to these people, that we view family planning education as an extension of personal liberty.
And you can find that film in the National Archives. Signing off for Infowars.com. And again, this world government system has explained to us, has lectured us, has told us how they're going to control the number of human beings, who's allowed to reproduce, and they've even bragged about how they're going to ration food supplies to keep the population in check. This goes back at least 100 years. Here's 3 key quotes. I've read them to you before on air, but I'll read them again because they're so important. In Ecoscience, that tyrannical manifesto written by John P. Holdren, the White House science czar, and by Paul Ehrlich, the population bomb guy, they wrote about the planetary regime they wanted to bring into being. The planetary regime might be given responsibility for determining the optimum population for the world and for each region, and for arbitrating various countries' shares within their regional limits. Control of population size might remain the responsibility of each government, but the regime should have some power to enforce the agreed limits. And they're talking about controlling the resources, allocating the food supplies, and everything else, telling you how much carbon you're allowed to use, as we're seeing in this current era. Henry Kissinger talked about the same thing. His famous quote, if you control the oil, you control the country. If you control food, you control the population. He said that in the early 1970s and then went on to formalize that policy under National Security Memorandum number 200, issued in 1974. That's the Food as a Weapon Doctrine. He wrote in part in that document, mandatory programs may be needed and we should be considering these possibilities now. It also said, would food be considered an instrument of national power? Is the U.S. prepared to accept food rationing to help people who can't or won't control their population growth? And again, he identified 13 key countries for immediate depopulation and bragged about how they're going to control the population and the populace in general through those ration food supplies. But it goes back even further to Lord Bertrand Russell, who wrote that seminal book, The Impact of Science on Society, in 1954. He said, to deal with the problem of increasing population and decreasing food supplies, it will be necessary to find ways of preventing an increase in world population. If this is not done through wars, pestilence, and famine, it will demand a powerful international authority. This authority should deal out the world's food to the various nations in proportion to their population. If any nation subsequently increased its population, it should not on that account receive any food. Therefore, the motive for not increasing population would be very compelling. And he writes how a government that distributes and controls the food is absolute as long as it can count on the police and armed forces to enforce those policies. How damning and thorough is that? That's the martial law scenario they're moving towards. Complete control of the economy, of your food supplies, disarmament. They want to control everything. It's not a loving socialist government.